One of the TV shows that I've enjoyed the most in the last few years has been Succession. I think it was on Sky, and it's loosely based on the life and the family of Rupert Murdoch, a kind of fictional version of that. You've got Logan Roy, who's the father and the patriarch, and he's fabulously rich. He owns a media empire, and he's got a bunch of kids, and the whole thing is about who is going to be in succession. Who is this great empire going to be passed on to? But, like any good drama, it's filled with absolutely shed loads of dysfunction and chaos within the family, because as we go on, we find out that not a lot of the children, the suitors, have much merit of their own, or even skill or acumen, certainly not like their dads. And the only thing that keeps the family together, really, is the dad's ego, his prowess. And once he kind of disappears from the scene, I don't want to give any spoilers away in case anyone actually wants to watch it and hasn't seen it, but once he goes, there's just not much left of any substance to unite them and keep them together. And we're quite often faced in one way or another with the question in church of, what are we here for? What actually unites us and binds us? If we are a family in any description, then is it a functional one or a disordered one? And what actually keeps us together when perhaps it does start to feel a little more dysfunctional? What pictures does the scripture use for our being together? I want to think about that this morning, because in the passage that Margaret read for us in 1 Peter's a letter written within the early church, probably within the first century. And in the early church, it really is a ragtag collection. You've got people who'd converted from Judaism. You've got people who'd come in from the cold as pagans in the Greek and the Roman world. And somehow, all these folks have to come together and make sense of this common faith that they have, and somehow live in community as well, because they comprise all different social classes as well, which was perhaps the difference in the stratification was much more pronounced than what we're used to today. So how can they all be brought together? That's the challenge, if you like, that the early church pastors like Peter had. And Peter goes all the way back to the start and the founding of the people of God in order to ground their identity. You might have noticed, the eagle-eyed and eared amongst you might have noticed that a lot of 2 Peter's language is just directly lifted from the Old Testament, particularly from Exodus 19. So here's where Peter takes his people. He takes them to the foot of Mount Sinai. If you like, one of the founding events of what it was for the people of God to have an identity. Do you remember the story where the people of God had been enslaved in Egypt? They were liberated and rescued directly by God, and then they gather at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God gives them their new identity, their new constitution, if you like, as a people. And there's the images of the flaming fires of the mountain, and God dwells with Moses at the top, but he brings him down with a message to unite this people. And also he seems to be drawing on the fact that in the Old Testament times, at first, the people of God are just one race, one ethnicity, one people, really, who are the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham. But there are hints even in the Old Testament, if we go to books such as Isaiah, where there's promises that in the future, God is going to keep expanding his work and folding in more and more different kinds of races. At the time, it was their enemies, the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and Isaiah was told to directly prophesy they were going to sit down at the table of God's people as well, and they were going to be called one people. There's a message that God had was going to keep gathering new kinds of people into it. So, what I want to look at from 1 Peter's message today is 3 headings, and you'll have them on your little sheet if it's anything that you find helpful to follow along with. I want to look at first the calling of God's people, and then secondly, the unity of God's people, and thirdly and lastly, the purpose of God's people. So, the calling of God's people. Let's go to our passage that Margaret read for us. The living stone and a chosen people. We read this. As you come to him, the living stone, who was rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, offering sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus. And then down at verse 9, he says, just as Jesus was chosen, he was God's chosen representative to show us what God was like on earth. He says in verse 9, but you are a chosen people. Now he's speaking to the church as if they are kind of the new Israel. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. Let's think about that phrase, you are a chosen people, in terms of God's people and their calling. He was saying to them, this early church in the first century, that regardless of where you have come from, which stream you found yourself that brought you into this identity and fellowship and being part of God's people, regardless of where that was, you have been chosen and selected by God. Now, sometimes as a minister, particularly if I let people know I'm a bit of a Calvinist, they have the worst possible images of that in their mind. For a lot of people, Calvinism or God choosing people is the picture in their head is a kind of eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And God going, you're in, you're out, you're in, you're out, really arbitrarily. And if we're honest about the scriptures, there's nothing that cold or unfeeling about God's choosing of his people. And it actually has relatively little to say about the not being chosen. It's got far more to say about the being chosen. And I actually think that's a wonderful and a comforting truth about our calling as God's people. Because in Ephesians it says that from before the foundations of the earth that we were chosen by God. How can that not be immensely comforting? And I come from a tradition where quite often there was a lot of fretting over whether you were chosen or not, but the scriptures don't seem to encourage us to spend much time in doing that. Rather, they seem to be spending more time in assuring God's people who are fretting and usually weak and frail, and their faith sometimes even comes and goes, reassuring them and affirming them in their chosenness by God. It's a wonderful and a beautiful truth, because here, if he's got the Exodus in mind, in fact, I'll just go to Exodus 19, because some of the language there is a little bit more concrete. In Exodus 19, in verse 4, this is what God says to his people. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. This is the beautiful, comforting, and astounding truth about being chosen. God starts to work in your life and in your heart when you perhaps have no even thought of him, or if you do have a thought of him, you have no idea what he's up to. Because he is beginning to stir his love. He is beginning to draw you with the cords of his affection. He is beginning to open up to you the wonder and the possibility that what Jesus has come to do and reveal by living for us, by giving us the example of God's love, by then dying in our place and rising to defeat death, that could be applicable to you. And God does all of that so silently underneath the surface that by the time you're realizing anything, then he's already been working for a long time behind the scenes. One of my favorite parts of a liturgy that we say is when we're doing infant and child baptism. It's such a beautiful picture of the work of God in all our lives, because in that liturgy, the minister or whoever says, for you Jesus died and suffered the death and the darkness of Calvary. All this he did for you, and yet you do not know it. And of course, it's our hope and prayer that everybody that we baptize in time will come to realize that that is true of and for them. But isn't that true of and for all of us? Because being chosen isn't something that perhaps we have much clarity on, or sometimes maybe we even struggle with assurance. But can I direct you to the scriptures which are here supposed to make you full of assurance that you are a chosen people, God's special possession. Now, the implication of that is that everybody came in the same way. How? Because we've come by God's cornerstone, the foundation of our belief and of our faith. The one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. We all come by believing that in the possibility and the reality that Jesus has come for us and called us to his family, to his gathering, to his work. And that means it should flatten things out a bit. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but there is an amazing equality. There's no up and down in hierarchy, because Jesus says himself, how do people come in to faith? Through him. He calls himself the gateway, if you like, to faith in John chapter 10. He says anybody who comes out and around the outside is a thief and a robber. There's no other way but through Jesus. If there's no other way but through Jesus, no one has any reason for boasting or setting themselves up and over and against anyone else. We are all equally the chosen people. And the wonder of our calling is that all of that is possible because of the mercy of God. Once you had not received mercy, in verse 10, but now you have received mercy. That is literally all that makes a difference between God's people and not God's people. People who have received mercy and know it, and at one time they had not. And that's our calling. We are the people who God has carried and chosen and blessed us with his mercy. And then the unity of God's people. So Peter uses a couple of images from that sort of Old Testament world and pictorial sort of conception that is readily available and accessible for the believers. You also, verse 5, are like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So, offers a couple. Perhaps the most abstract is a priesthood. His first audience would have known all about a priesthood because whether they were Jews who had come in Judaism, the high priest had the most sacred of all jobs. He was the only one who was allowed to enter the most sacred inner sanctum of the temple or the tabernacle, only at certain times of the year. And it was the Holy of Holies. But even if they'd come from the pagan world, all the kind of pagan religions and temples, they had their own priests too. They were people who would understand to have the special credentials needed to access the very inner life of God. That's what a priest did. They went right to the center of God's presence. And they were special and different from everyone else in that they had the right and also the calling to be able to do that. And they did that on behalf of the people. Look at what he's saying now. You, the church, are now the priesthood. Everybody. This is something that we really recovered at the Reformation. I'm fond of going on a bit about this, but really, there shouldn't be anything too special about clergy in our tradition, about ministers and people who, yes, were ordained to do the sacraments and preach the word. But apart from that, a lot of what we do should be something that we share with the whole body. The priesthood of all believers. We are all a royal priesthood together. We all collectively, when we come together, somehow, and it's somewhat mysterious, but we somehow represent that inner life of God. And we represent it to others, and it's something that happens when we're gathered together. The very inner life of God is shared with us here. And also he uses this kind of architectural idea. You are being built like living stones into a spiritual house. There's often a debate about what the church is. Is it, or a debate? Perhaps it's an easy idiom to say the church is the people, not the buildings. But we need buildings. Buildings are important, and I did a whole message on that earlier in the year. But the heartbeat of it is the people, is the different individuals brought together. And somehow, when they're all brought together, there is this thing called the church where God has decided to represent himself to our world today. It's a living, breathing thing that requires all the individuals to come together, and then when they're together, something happens. You might know that. There's probably no easier way to illustrate this than through experience. I came across the story this week of Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Some of you might be aware of him. He was a Welsh preacher in the 20th century. Really, really gifted preacher. All those sermons went on for about an hour, so they weren't for the faint of heart. He was a great theologian and very practical, very helpful. But he was preaching after World War II, and during his ministry in London, the advent of technology started to come about, and it became possible to start taping sermons. And he was ambivalent about it. He wasn't sure whether to allow it or not, and many people like me are grateful that he did allow it because we've heard his sermons. We're glad they were taped. But this is why he wasn't sure of it. And it's something I've wrestled with as well, is there's something about being in the presence of the gathered church where we expect God to work in a special way. And I know what he meant. The reason I'm standing here today is because I heard and received my calling into the ministry listening to a sermon, sitting underneath a sermon and feeling like the preacher was speaking directly to me, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I thought, I need to take this seriously. In the Reformed tradition, we put preaching and the word right at the center because we actually expect God to speak through it, because we believe he's promised to speak through preaching and the word and to do something in our souls when we're here. And there's something even more special that really only happens when we gather to it. I'll be honest, I struggled without it during the pandemic. Sitting in my living room talking to a screen hoping someone was on the other end, because it felt unnatural, because there's a sense in which God has promised to work in this way. Now, I'm not speaking with a forked tongue. I'm so grateful for our tech and the fact that we are able to reach so many other people through that and bless them and help them, perhaps because they can't be here, because we don't want to be ableist at all. There are a million reasons that stop people from gathering. But that doesn't take away from the specialness of something just happens when we gather, and God is present in a special way because he's constituted us as a priesthood where God's presence is accessed through his priestly people, and also as a spiritual house where he's decided to make this a kind of repository of his goodness and of his presence. And that all comes through our unity, through our uniting together. And I can't explain that much better than that, so I'm going to move on. That's about as good as I can do, because there's just a mystical element to that I think is beyond the ken of any of our explanation, but it's better experienced. Perhaps the application is to expect that, is to expect in your life and in your church, rather than it being something routine and that we go through, is to go, I wonder what God is going to say. I wonder how he's going to speak. I wonder how he's going to move and stir my heart. I wonder what he's going to do in my life. Excitement, expectation, because when we are united, God is here. And lastly, that's the calling of God's people, the unity of God's people, and lastly, the purpose of God's people. Why are we really here? So what? What's the point? Apart from its great experience, hopefully, what is the point? I think there's a few hints at what we're supposed to be here for and what we do. I think there's an exemplary function to what we do in gathering here. You're a chosen people, royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. I love that image. If you're declaring the praises, that's for the benefit of someone else, because you're putting it out there. And God's people are to be a worshipping people, to gather and really be part of it, with knowing that they're a group of other people who are joined with them in worship, and that sends some sort of signal or message out. Now, it's a message of praise, but it can be picked up. I think Jesus illustrated this better than anyone else could when he told on the Sermon on the Mount what his followers were to be like. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. very often in the ancient world, cities would be built on some sort of elevated structure, not just for security and protection, but also for navigation. Because if it was lit up at night, it would be much easier to navigate by and see and find your way to. Can I suggest to you that being part of a church and being embedded in and grounded in it is a way to be part of something that sends a signal out to essentially what is a dark world? None of us can deny that there is light here. That as we've been thinking about, God has called us out of darkness into light. Do we want to keep that light to ourselves? No. We want to be part of a group that are involved in showing that we have found the light of God, and we would love everyone else to be able to find and discover it too. And surely there are more folks that could do with coming out of darkness into the light. And that's part of the calling that we've got. But perhaps more practically, I really wanted to circle back again onto the idea of being a spiritual house built by living stones. He says, you are like living stones, because I think there's some really important implications of that for us. If you think about when a building is put together, no two stones will be exactly the same. They'll be uniform perhaps in size, but every single one will be cut and have its own characteristics if you really study it. And different types of either stone or block work, I mean, this was much more true in the ancient world, but to a degree it's still true. When a building is going up, there are different materials and parts needed for different things that will hold a different function. And I think that's got something so key to say to us about our purpose. In many ways, the church should be a place, and hopefully church membership should be a place where we find our purpose, where we find what it is that God has asked us to fit and plug into, where we find what God has made us to be, the gifts, the callings, the abilities, the things he's put inside, the passions that he's put inside of us. Let me be a wee bit more practical. From our own example, our church runs because people do have different gifts and abilities, and they use them. And the things that some people are good at, other people wouldn't be at all. I am so grateful that there are so many people in the church that are so good at things that I am rubbish at. Seriously, what I do is just a small part of it. There's lots of things that would make the church collapse if it wasn't for the fact that other people are good at things that I am absolutely hopeless at. Some people are good with numbers and with finance. Some people are good at organizing things and getting other people together. Other folks are so good at caring and pastoral stuff. I mean, hopefully I'm good at that too. But so these are not all things that I'm rubbish at. But some folks are absolutely so called and dedicated to prayer that in many ways, and I feel the effect of this, their prayers really help to grease the wheels of the church and to keep it moving forward, because they take it so seriously and they're so fervent in praying for the church and the ministry and people who are involved in it. There are just so many little different pieces and different places that we can find our niche and all fit together. And there are all different parts and sizes of things that go into making a building good, and there are all different parts and sizes. And so whatever your shape or how you're made up or how you're constituted, you should be able to find your fit in the church. Can I encourage you in that? Perhaps you think that you don't have much to offer. I guarantee you that you do. And even more so, the church actually needs whatever it is that you have, or whoever it is that you are, because it doesn't really work very well if everybody isn't a living stone. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that we are here to extract value from you, and church can be like that sometimes, and I hate it. What I mean is that you are so animated by what you find here in terms of hopefully your connection to God and feeling his presence, sensing his love, sensing the love of other people and his people, that it is the natural overflow and inclination of your heart that you want to find out what it is you can do to continue to make the life of the church go so that it can continue to be a light to others. We are here and we're called into this because God has chosen us. And far from that being a reason for arrogance or haughtiness in any way, it's just equally humbling for all of us, because he did it by his mercy, not because we were so brilliant or great, but because he is so kind and generous and eager to show his love and generosity to us. And we're here as people who have experienced that. Once we were a people who had not received mercy, now we're a people who have received mercy. And then when we unite and we come together and we do that well and we play our part and we take our place, somehow God is here in the midst of us, and he's given us the task and the priesthood, if you like, the responsibility of being the center and hosting and holding his presence so that people can come. And we're able to say, come and experience and hear from the living and the true God. What an invitation. Because we're united, and the degree to which we're united, I would say, probably commands that sense of God's blessing and presence. But also, we have a purpose beyond just being in here, and it's not just a holy huddle. We have a purpose as those who have been shown mercy and love, to show that light, to display it, to broadcast it, so that anybody who's looking to the horizon can continue to see that this is a place of the love and the light of God. And that's our purpose, and that's something that we all get to be part of. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.